The starship Aegis slid from the darkness of Slipstream into orbit above the fortress world of Sirithus, her armored hull glowing faintly as the void distorted around her. Silence stretched across the bridge for a moment, the quiet before a storm, until Captain Elias Ward exhaled and rose from his command chair. His frame was solid but unremarkable, his voice calm, the kind of steady tone that gave even the most anxious crewman something to hold on to. He studied the tactical display, where hundreds of alien vessels hung motionless in defensive patterns. The galaxy's war had burned for centuries, and yet this was humanity's first step into it. To most of their allies, the newcomers were latecomers, fragile, untested, laughably emotional. To Ward, they were still human, and that meant something different than numbers on a screen. Dr. Marcus Hale leaned against the rail near the medical station, arms crossed. His eyes, thoughtful and deep-set, held a peculiar brightness. Where Ward radiated composure, Marcus carried quiet conviction. He had argued for weeks with the alien strategists who dismissed humanity's resilience, explaining again and again that survival was not simply a question of biology or firepower. For Marcus, history itself was his weapon. He remembered Earth's endless string of catastrophes, plagues, world wars, ice ages, and how his species had endured not only by fighting but by laughing, by gathering together, by telling stories in the dark. He knew that truth was their edge, even if their allies could not yet see it. At the helm, Lieutenant Jonah Riker tapped a rhythmic pattern against the console, a nervous habit he never managed to break. Younger than the others, quick to grin, quick to flare, Jonah carried with him the heat of someone unwilling to surrender to fear. He had a reckless streak that made the older officers mutter, yet he never left a man behind. He lived on adrenaline and loyalty in equal measure. In the reflection of the canopy glass, his eyes followed the alien fleets with restless anticipation, as though daring them to strike first. Beside the tactical map, Commander Lukendrell stood with his arms clasped behind his back, shoulders squared with rigid precision. He was the mind of the ship, an architect of maneuvers whose reputation was already circulating among the alien admirals. Drell rarely spoke more than he had to, and his sharp profile gave him an almost carved quality, a man sculpted for discipline. Yet beneath that iron mask, there was a private longing for something softer. Moments he kept to himself, small comforts that reminded him he was more than the war machine he was expected to be. The arrival of the Aegis was greeted with reserved silence from the Cyrathian command flotilla. Alien officers blinked their many eyes or flicked their chitinous mandibles in wordless disdain. To them, humanity's presence was a curiosity, like children wandering into a battlefield. They measured worth in centuries of conflict, in generations bred for war. Humanity's habit of clinging to nostalgia, of speaking of hearth and home, was not a strength in their eyes, it was a flaw. Ward allowed the alien scrutiny to wash over him, his attention fixed instead on his own men. He understood his duty was not only to fight but to preserve something fragile and irreplaceable, something he feared might be lost if they surrendered entirely to the galaxy's brutal logic. "Report," he said evenly. Drell answered with crisp details: enemy activity in the sector, the state of Allied defenses, projections of possible engagements. Marcus added medical readiness, with a quiet warning that alien triage protocols would leave many to die. Jonah muttered a curse under his breath at that, earning him a sharp glance from Drell, but Ward did not correct him. Anger was human, and sometimes anger was right. Later, as the ship settled into a tenuous routine above Sirithus, the crew gathered in the mess. The room was plain, gray bulkheads, humming lights, but warmth gathered in the corners where men spoke in low voices, where laughter flickered despite exhaustion. Jonah returned from a supply run with a grin and a surprise, a battered tin of cocoa powder scavenged from Earth's dwindling reserves. He brewed it clumsily, but when the scent filled the air, conversation slowed, and eyes lifted. It was such a small thing, and yet it bound them together, that sweetness carried across space. They sat shoulder to shoulder at the tables, cups in hand, speaking of nothing and everything. Captain Ward entered last, carrying a book so worn its spine was nearly gone. He set it on the table and flipped to a marked page. Without preamble, he began to read. His voice wrapped the men in a story of children gathered by a fireplace, snow falling against ancient stone windows, warmth in the cold. It was a passage from an old series, words that painted a school filled with comfort and light in the face of looming shadows. Some men chuckled, some listened in silence, but all leaned closer, drawn not only to the tale but to the familiarity it carried. Through the viewport, alien officers watched in bewilderment. What was this ritual, this frivolous indulgence? They could not comprehend why warriors would spend precious time with books and cocoa when battle loomed. To them, war was pure mathematics. To humans, war was bearable only because of these small rebellions against despair. Marcus, sitting near the captain, noted the expressions of their observers and smiled faintly. Let them misunderstand. That misunderstanding would one day cost their enemies dearly. When Ward closed the book, the room was filled with a silence that felt whole, not empty. Jonah lifted his mug in a mock toast, and laughter returned, quiet but real. Drell even allowed himself the smallest of smiles, a fleeting thing quickly hidden. Marcus leaned back, satisfied that once again, against the weight of alien doubt and the approach of violence, his people had proved themselves not by the weapons they carried, but by the warmth they chose to kindle. Yet beyond Syrithus, the enemy stirred. The fleet that had burned half the galaxy had already set its gaze upon this sector. Soon the Aegis and her crew would be tested in ways no reading, no warmth, no cocoa could shield them from. But for that one evening, within the gray walls of a warship suspended above an alien world, humanity declared itself in laughter, in stories, in the simple act of being together. And in the quiet that followed, every man in the room knew that whatever storm came next, they would face it as more than soldiers. They would face it as humans. The enemy arrived without warning, black ships sliding out of the void like blades drawn from scabbards. Sirens howled across the Aegis as the bridge flared crimson with alert lights. Captain Elias Ward gripped the railing by his chair, his gaze fixed on the tactical display where crimson markers bloomed in dangerous proximity. His voice cut through the rising tension, steady and unhurried, the voice of a man who knew that calm was sometimes sharper than command. All stations, battle readiness. Drell, projections. Commander Lucan Drell's hands flew across the console, his movements clipped and precise. Enemy fleet, 36 vessels. Configuration suggests a vanguard strike group, likely probing for weaknesses. Cyrathian allies are redeploying into rigid formations along their standard defense line. His jaw tightened. Their predictability will cost us. Ward said nothing at first, studying the alien deployments on the screen. They clustered into geometric patterns, unyielding in their doctrine. Effective perhaps in theory, but brittle. He glanced toward Lieutenant Jonah Riker at the helm. The young pilot was already leaning forward in his chair, fingers twitching over the controls like a duelist itching for the first move. Jonah, Ward said quietly, you'll need to improvise. I want those enemy ships confused before they can form a spearhead. Riker grinned, though the light in his eyes carried a razor's edge. Confusion's my specialty, sir. He adjusted his headset, muttering something under his breath about showing the aliens what a human could do with a fighter's guts and a bad idea. Dr. Marcus Hale stood near the medbay relay, already preparing triage protocols. He spoke with the calm of someone who knew blood would soon stain the decks. I'll need wounded brought in immediately. Alien medics will wait for statistical thresholds before deploying aid. We don't. His gaze swept the men around him. Remember, we save who we can, as we always have. No one left behind. The first salvo slammed into Allied shields. The Aegis trembled but held, her reinforced plating groaning under the strain. Ward barked crisp orders while Drell recalculated vectors, within human speed. The alien formations began to buckle, their rigid walls unable to flex against the enemy's unpredictable maneuvers. Amid the chaos, human voices rang out over the comms, improvised calls, unsanctioned warnings, jokes even, threaded with courage. The alien allies heard them and were baffled. Discipline, to them, was silence. To humans, it was the refusal to let fear choke the line. Jonah's fighter squadron launched from the hangar, engines blazing. He darted between enemy ships with reckless artistry, drawing fire, then twisting into maneuvers that should have torn the hull apart. Over comms, his laughter crackled, sharp and defiant. "Missed me, you bastards." He clipped the flank of an enemy corvette with a swarm of missiles, sending the vessel spinning into its neighbor. "That's one down. Who's next?" On the bridge, Drell scowled but could not deny the results. Ward let the grin tug at the corner of his mouth only after issuing a firm, "Stay alive, Lieutenant. I'd hate to find out I trusted a dead man with my squadron." Hours blurred into a storm of fire and void. The Aegis fought not with perfection but with adaptation, reshaping itself around each blow. Marcus's medbay overflowed, and still he moved among the wounded with a steady voice, cracking small jokes to keep fear at bay. "You'll live, soldier. Worst scar you'll have is a story you'll tell badly at parties." Men bled and laughed at once, carried by something invisible and distinctly human. The alien observers, cold-blooded tacticians, watched through shared channels with growing disbelief. The humans were not fighting as soldiers. They were fighting as brothers. By the time the enemy fleet pulled back, licking its wounds, Ceritus still stood. Alien allies had suffered heavy losses, their formation shattered, but the humans endured, scarred yet unbroken. Ward gave the order to cease fire, his shoulders heavy but his eyes sharp. Victory here was not total, but it was proof. Proof that humanity's way, chaotic, emotional, reckless, had teeth. When the fires were finally extinguished, the men gathered again in the mess. Their uniforms were stained, their hands still shaking from adrenaline, but they were alive. Jonah slumped into a chair, sweat plastering his hair, and pulled a dented flask from his pocket. "To improvisation," he muttered, raising it, and several men laughed through their exhaustion. Marcus appeared with a tray of mugs, the cocoa rations stretched thin but enough to go around. "Medicine," he said with mock solemnity, passing them out one by one. The warmth of the drink spread through them, a fragile comfort that felt like defiance against the cold of war. Ward arrived late, the book in his hand again, its spine more worn with each reading. He did not ask if they wished to hear. He simply began. The passage he chose spoke of snow and holiday feasts, of laughter echoing in stone halls safe from the dark outside. The words painted pictures brighter than the sterile steel around them, brighter than the memory of blood still drying on the decks. Some men closed their eyes and let the voices of their comrades and the rhythm of the story wrap them in peace. Jonah leaned back, grinning faintly, as though for the first time since takeoff he allowed himself to breathe. Drell sat rigid at first, then, almost imperceptibly, allowed his shoulders to lower. Marcus, sipping from his mug, watched the faces around him with satisfaction. The reading ended not in applause but in silence, thick, steady silence that spoke of survival and something deeper. They were still human, and that was their greatest weapon. Outside, alien officers stared through observation ports at the scene, uncomprehending. They saw warriors who, hours after battle, chose not to sharpen blades or calculate odds but to share warmth, stories, and drink. To them, it was absurd. To the humans, it was necessary. For in those moments, they remembered what? Darkness settled heavy over Ceritus, the kind of darkness that felt alive, as though the void itself pressed against the hull of the Aegis. The enemy had not returned in force since the first clash, yet their silence was more menacing than their weapons. On the bridge, every man felt it. Captain Elias Ward stood at the viewport, his reflection faint in the glass, his posture steady, but his thoughts a storm. He had carried his crew through fire, but now the galaxy conspired to grind them down slowly, starving them, testing how long men could endure on dwindling rations and dwindling hope. He knew battles of attrition could shatter a spirit more efficiently than cannons. Commander Lucan Drell monitored the tactical grid in grim silence. His mind devoured every report, supply lines severed, reinforcements delayed, alien allies faltering. The mathematics painted a portrait of doom. He was a man who trusted patterns, yet now the patterns betrayed him. No strategy could conjure fuel from empty tanks or food from barren storerooms. He wrestled with frustration, unwilling to let the men see it. They looked to him for certainty, and certainty had become his armor. But deep inside, he envied Ward's strange gift, the ability to inspire with warmth when numbers could only condemn. Dr. Marcus Hale moved constantly between medbay and barracks. The wounded overflowed his limited space, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and the strained silence of men clinging to life. He had worked until his hands trembled, until exhaustion blurred his vision, but he refused to stop. When words of comfort ran dry, he resorted to stories, speaking of Earth as if it were just beyond the bulkhead. He described snowy mornings in quiet towns, with fires flickering, the kind of imagery that made soldiers forget for a moment the cold bite of the void. He knew his patients did not need truth as much as they needed something worth enduring for. Jonah Riker had grown restless. The young pilot prowled the hangar like a caged predator, his fighter scarred from battle but ready to fly. He hated waiting more than fighting, hated the way silence gnawed at him. His laughter still rang loud, but it carried a sharper edge, as though he laughed to keep from breaking. Some of the younger men clung to him, his defiance a lifeline. He let them, even when he wanted to be alone. Jonah did not speak of fear, though it pressed heavy in his chest. He feared not dying but watching everyone else fade while he stood helpless. The central conflict tightened like a noose. Survival was no longer a matter of winning battles, but of enduring despair. Alien allies began to withdraw, their cold logic declaring Sirithus lost. They abandoned their wounded, their voices on comms flat as they severed ties. To them, human stubbornness was folly. To Ward, it was the only path left. "We stay," he declared, his voice echoing in the mess hall. "We hold this line, even if the galaxy decides it's worthless. Because we don't measure worth by probability. We measure it by lives, by loyalty." His words struck deep. Even Drell, who preferred the certainty of numbers, felt a strange fire stir in him. That night, the men gathered in the ruins of a Cyrathian outpost they had repurposed into a temporary shelter. The walls were shattered, ceilings cracked, the air sharp with dust. And yet, within those broken halls, humanity carved out something more than survival. Jonah scavenged scraps of metal and rigged a crude brazier. Marcus found enough fuel to spark a flame. The men circled it, shoulders brushing, faces aglow with light that pushed back the darkness. They shared the last crumbs of food as if it were a feast. Ward produced the battered book again, its pages barely holding together, and began to read. His voice carried passages of snow-covered halls, laughter by firesides, the magic of safety. In that broken ruin, the words painted warmth on cold stone. Drell, sitting apart at first, found himself listening. He had always dismissed such rituals as distractions, but something shifted inside him. He studied the faces around the fire, the way men smiled through exhaustion, the way their eyes glistened with something like hope, and he realized strategy could never explain this resilience. Perhaps this was the true weapon of their kind, the ability to make a home in the ruins, to kindle light where logic demanded only resignation. Marcus observed the men as they leaned closer to the flame, their bodies exhausted, but their spirits mending. He thought of history, of how his species had survived ice ages not with strength alone but with fire and story. He whispered to himself, "This is who we are." When Ward closed the book, silence lingered, but it was a full silence, heavy with shared belonging. Even Jonah, who usually filled quiet with laughter, said nothing, his expression unguarded for once. He let himself simply feel the warmth. The moment could not last. Scouts reported enemy movements, the first signs of a renewed offensive. Supplies were still near gone, the fleet fractured. Yet the men rose from that fire with a different posture. The enemy could strip them of ships, of food, of rest, but they could not strip them of that fire in their chests. They would fight not because numbers said they could win, but because they refused to surrender what made them human. As the Aegis prepared to return to orbit, Ward stood before his crew one final time that night. His words were fewer than before, his voice low but resolute. They'll come soon. They'll come harder than ever. And when they do, remember this fire. Remember tonight. Let it remind you what we're fighting for. Not for glory. Not even for survival. But for each other. That's enough. The men nodded, their eyes carrying that glow. For the first time in days, despair loosened its grip. Above them, enemy ships gathered like storm clouds ready to break. On the Aegis, men strapped into stations, hearts heavy yet burning. The darkest hour had arrived, but within it flickered something alien forces could never calculate: the refusal to let darkness claim their spirit. The story was far from over, and every man aboard knew it. The fire had been lit, and it would burn until the end. The void rippled with fire as the enemy's armada descended, blotting out the stars in a wall of steel and fury. On the bridge of the Aegis, every console burned with warnings, every sensor screamed of the overwhelming force barreling toward them. Captain Elias Ward stood at the center, steady as the gravity beneath their boots, his voice carrying a clarity that cut through the panic. "They mean to end us here," he said, not to frighten but to affirm the truth. His crew needed truth more than comfort now, though he offered both in every word he chose. "Then let's show them what humans do when the dark comes for us." Commander Lukendrell's eyes flicked across the tactical readouts. His face remained carved from stone, but beneath the mask was a mind working at fever pitch. He mapped out every vector, every possible stratagem, and found none that promised survival. Yet he did not allow despair to surface. Instead, he shifted the board in his thoughts, recalculating not how to preserve themselves, but how to break the enemy's rhythm. Human unpredictability was their one advantage. "If we fracture their vanguard here," he murmured, fingers tracing imaginary lines on the display, "we can force hesitation. And hesitation is the one luxury they can't afford." Dr. Marcus Hale listened from his post by the medbay relay, his arms streaked with the blood of soldiers he had tended only hours before. His face was calm, almost serene, though exhaustion pressed heavily at the corners of his eyes. He understood what Drell implied. This battle might demand more than survival, it might demand sacrifice. Marcus felt the weight of history pressing on his chest. Humanity had always been outnumbered, outgunned, outthought. Yet never once had they surrendered their spirit. "If this is the night we're written into the galaxy's story," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else, "then let it be said we faced it with our heads unbowed." Jonah Riker broke the tension with a sharp laugh, his voice ragged but still burning with energy. He had already strapped himself into his flight suit, helmet tucked under one arm, restless like a wolf caged too long. "Then I suppose it's my turn to make the galaxy nervous. Tell me where to hit, Commander, and I'll hit it so hard they'll still be feeling it when the next sun rises." His bravado was real, but it was also armor, thin as glass. He knew as well as anyone what the odds were, yet he carried that fear the only way he knew, by charging straight at it with fire in his eyes. Ward's gaze lingered on Jonah a moment longer than necessary. He could see the truth behind the grin. The young pilot had always flown on the knife's edge between brilliance and disaster. Perhaps that was why he embodied humanity's paradox so perfectly: fragile and reckless, yet somehow unbreakable. "You'll get your chance," Ward said finally, his tone both permission and benediction. "But remember, bravery means nothing if it leaves your brothers behind." The enemy struck, and the galaxy split open with violence. The Aegis shuddered as shockwaves battered her hull. Alien allies fell back into strict formations, collapsing under the weight of the first assault. Their ships cracked like glass against the relentless tide. The human fleet, fewer and smaller, scattered like sparks, weaving through the chaos in maneuvers no alien algorithm could predict. Drell barked rapid adjustments, Ward steadied voices across the comms, Marcus readied his medics, and Jonah led his squadron straight into the maw of the storm. The enemy flagship loomed ahead, colossal and impenetrable, its weapons carving swaths of fire through everything in its path. Jonah darted his fighter between its shields, missiles streaking from his wings in a desperate dance. He knew the odds, he always had, but in this moment he became more than a pilot. He became every story humanity had ever told of heroes who refused to kneel. His laughter over the calms was wild and ragged. "Come on, you monsters. Chase me." He drew their fire, every blast that might have annihilated the Aegis redirected toward his single fragile vessel. His final maneuver carried him into the heart of their shield array, and his last words were a whisper that cracked with pride. "For home." The detonation tore the flagship's defenses apart in a blaze so bright it seared itself into memory. On the Aegis, silence reigned for a breath, the absence of Jonah's voice heavier than any explosion. Ward closed his eyes, grief pressing against his composure. But he knew grief could wait. "Drell," he said quietly, "take the opening." And Drell, eyes blazing though his expression never changed, unleashed every ship under his command into the breach Jonah had carved with his life. The enemy staggered, the unthinkable happening, their flawless lines fractured, their perfect rhythm disrupted. For the first time in centuries of war, the galaxy's oppressors faltered. Marcus worked tirelessly as the ship bucked and groaned, his hands red, his voice steady. He spoke to every wounded man as though each one were the only soul alive. "Hold on," he whispered again and again. "You'll see the dawn." His words were a lifeline, binding men to life with threads stronger than medicine. Ward watched him through the haze of battle, recognizing the truth he had always known. Humanity's strength was not only in its warriors, but in its healers, its storytellers, its capacity to care even when caring seemed impossible. The turning point came not from weapons alone, but from something stranger. Across allied frequencies, recordings of the humans' strange rituals. Laughter in the mess, the captain reading from a tattered book, men drinking cocoa in tin cups, were broadcast. Ward had not ordered it, but somewhere, someone among their allies had understood the message. Across the battlefield, alien crews listened to these fragments of human defiance, and something shifted. Fear loosened its grip. Ships that were about to break held fast. Soldiers who thought themselves doomed fought harder. The enemy, facing a tide they could not calculate, began to waver. The Aegis drove forward, her guns blazing, Drell's maneuvers weaving chaos through the enemy's ranks. Ward stood firm, his voice on the comms like a beacon. Marcus patched the wounded, his exhaustion hidden behind relentless compassion. And though Jonah's fighter was gone, his sacrifice burned brighter than the wreckage of any ship, his courage becoming the banner under which the fleet rallied. At last, the enemy broke. Their formations shattered, their retreat inevitable. The void that had been fire and ruin only moments before began to clear. Silence fell, but it was a silence filled with disbelief, then dawning realization. They had survived. More than survived, they had won. The hangar bay of the Aegis was battered and half-dark when the survivors gathered. Men sat on crates, leaned against walls, their faces hollow but their eyes alive. Marcus moved among them with mugs filled from the last of the cocoa ration, pressing warmth into trembling hands. Ward arrived with the book once more, its pages frayed, its cover bent, but its words intact. He read aloud, his voice quiet, yet carrying across the room, a passage of feasts and firesides, of safety found within ancient walls. The men listened, not because they needed distraction, but because they needed to remember why they fought at all. When he closed the book, no one spoke. Instead, they raised their cups in a silent toast, honoring the dead, honoring Jonah, honoring the fragile yet unbreakable thread that bound them together. Even Drell, ever the stoic, inclined his head, the faintest sign of respect for the boy who had flown too close to eternity. Marcus sat at Ward's side, his weary smile carrying both sorrow and pride. They had faced annihilation, and they had endured not through strength alone but through the strange, ineffable fire of humanity. Beyond the hangar walls, Sirithus was safe, and the enemy was in retreat. But Ward knew this was no end. It was only a beginning. The galaxy had seen what humanity could do, what they carried with them into the darkest battles. They were not the strongest, nor the oldest, nor the most advanced. But they were the ones who, in the teeth of despair, built fires out of ashes and told stories to chase back the dark. That truth was their weapon, and it had carried them to victory. And as the men sat together in the dim light, sharing the last of their warmth and listening to the echoes of a story from a world long behind them, the captain knew that whatever wars lay ahead, the galaxy would never again dismiss humanity. It would fear them, respect them, and perhaps, just perhaps, learn from them. For in the vast cold void, it was not steel or fire that endured longest. It was the human heart,